Today we're going to start to discuss experimental design and an important distinction between observational studies and experiments. So, like I said, observational studies versus experiments. We really do need to make sure that we understand this distinction between the two because it will then indicate what type of conclusions we can draw in the long run. Basically, something's considered to be an observational study if it simply observes what's happening in a natural setting. So there is no attempt to influence the responses. An experiment is going to impose some sort of treatment or potentially treatments on a group of individuals. And so if we're trying to establish a cause and effect relationship, we have to have an experimental study. Otherwise, any conclusions that we draw aren't necessarily valid because there could be other variables in play and we're looking at an observational study. So in terms of observational studies, there are two vocab terms for us to be aware of. One is called a retrospective study and one is called a prospective study. So a retrospective study is going to look at previously existing data or things that have happened in the past. So kind of think of retro as your prefix there that'll help you remember that. The prospective studies are going to track a group of individuals into the future. So think about the pro here, meaning going forward or into the future. So if you select a group of individuals and decide to watch them from now until, say, 10 years from now, that would be a prospective study. If you selected a group of individuals and looked into things that had happened previously, that would be a retrospective study. So when we talk about observational studies, a lot of times we cannot establish cause and effect because we're not able to distinguish the differences between an actual influence and what we call either confounding or lurking variables. So a lurking variable is just a variable that's not in the explanatory or response variables being studied, but it might still influence the response. So maybe you're looking at an individual's health. Well, there are a lot of variables that influence an individual's health. Do they exercise? What kind of diet do they have? What kind of access to health care do they have? All of those things, if they're not directly controlled for or directly being studied as an explanatory variable, are considered lurking variables. And then confounding happens when two variables are associated in a way that you cannot really pull them apart between the effects on the response variable. So two explanatory variables or potentially two lurking variables that are really kind of twisted together and you can't distinguish their impact on the response. So if you have a well-designed experiment, you're going to control for lurking variables and you're going to take steps to avoid confounding. And we'll talk about several different ways that that can happen in section 4.2. Before we get to that point, we do need to talk about some vocab terms. So we have the vocabulary term of treatment. So the treatment is the condition that's applied to the individuals. And then the experimental units are the individuals that are in the experiment. If we're looking at humans, usually we call those experimental units subjects, but just know that those terms are interchangeable. So sometimes we call the explanatory variables factors, and then sometimes we talk about leveling. So levels might be the different values of those factors. So here's an example of SAT prep. I'll give you guys a minute to read the example. So here, we can't necessarily say that the online course improved the SAT scores, Because there are a lot of variables at play here. We have things like the fact that maybe just the very motivated students took this online prep course and took it more seriously. Or maybe just the fact that you're working with a different group of individuals than you worked with in the past could influence that difference. So we really need to figure out how we can control for these things and make a more complex experiment. So here you see just an outlined experiment where you have students who are taking an online course. So the students are your experimental units, the online course is your treatment, and then the response is their SAT scores. And so here, we probably want to do something else aside from just an online course in order to make it a well-designed experiment. Maybe we have the online versus an in-class or in-person course, and then maybe versus a control group that doesn't take a course at all. And then we look at those SAT scores at the end. And those are things that we're going to learn the vocabulary about and learn how to implement in the next couple of days. So a lot of lab experiments use a design like the one that you just saw, where you just have your experimental units receiving some treatment and then you measure some response. If you're in a lab environment, you can usually control for a lot of outside factors. But in the real world, we have to control for a lot of those other factors in different ways. So when we talk about field experiments, that would be something that's happening in the field, so meaning outside of the lab, or experiments with animals or people, you have more variable conditions. And so the reason animals or people have more variable conditions is just because they're all coming from different backgrounds, and all of those different things might influence their response. So outside of the lab, meaning in the field, or when we're dealing with animals or people, we usually are not going to get meaningful results from a simple experiment like this one here because of confounding and lurking variables. So for today, it's really just focusing on that distinction between an observational study and an experiment, and then just making sure that you know those terms for experimental units and treatments and explanatory and response variables. And then we'll get into more well-designed experiments next week. What kind of things do we need to do to account for things like lurking variables?